Hello? Hello? Okay, now it's working. Welcome. Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for sharing your noon time with us today. I am Crystal Cantlin. I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Manager here at the laboratory. I work with Diversity and Inclusion Council. There's a few members here in the audience. This is a presentation from the Perspectives on Diversity, which is sponsored by the Diversity and Inclusion Council Speaker and Social Activities Committee. So that's what you're here for. Hopefully that's what you attended to be here for. So again, welcome. I won't take too much of your time. I want to let you know that the Diversity and Inclusion Council is the body here at the laboratory that has representation from most all divisions. We meet on a regular basis to implement activities and policies and procedures for a more inclusive work environment here. The most recent thing we've been working on quite a bit is the UCOP climate survey, so you'll be getting a lot of information for that. Additionally, in addition to today's talk, the Diversity and Inclusion Council Speaker and Socials Activity, DISA as we like to be called, have a few events coming up later on this year that I wanted to just put a plug in for that if I could. Next month on August 18th, we have Jeanette Brown is coming. She is an African-American chemist. She should have a very interesting talk. That presentation is presented by DISA as well as Women's Science Engineering Council at the laboratory. We also will be hosting the annual Cocoa Festival that's usually here at the cafeteria. And then we'll close up the calendar year in November with what we call Popcorn in a Movie. And the Popcorn in a Movie this time is going to honor our vets here at the laboratory, and we'll be showing the film Honor Flight. Thank you. I have the video. I've seen it 3 or 4 times. So it's Honor Flight. So if you have time open, please add those to your calendar. We'd love to see you there. And before I get any further, I want to introduce Ingrid Peterson. She's going to introduce our speaker today. Ingrid is the individual that connected DISA with Arlene. So we're very appreciative to Ingrid for showing this to us, inviting us. Can't talk today. Thank you.
It's really a great pleasure to introduce Arlene Blum. Arlene her achievements are amazing. Not only as a scientist, a chemist, as well as an environmental scientist, a mountaineer, an author, just, you know, the list goes on. So Arlene actually founded in 2008 and is the executive director of the Green Science Institute, which is in Berkeley, and has been taking the leadership to remove or contribute to the removing chemicals from toxic chemicals that are flame retardants from children's clothes, as well as couches and so on. Also, Arlene is, you probably know, led the first women's expedition to Annapurna, which is one of the most challenging and dangerous mountains in the Himalayas, one of the 8,000-meter peaks. Also co-led the first women's expedition to Denali, and was the first woman, first American woman on Everest expedition. And also the author of 2 really amazing books. Annapurna, A Woman's Place, talks about the Annapurna Expedition, which took place in 1978. And that was the book that first made me aware of Arlene. I was a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara when I read that book, and that book really inspired me to become a physicist as well as a mountaineer and climber. And also the other book, Arlene, which is Breaking Trail, is also a pretty inspiring book. I met Arlene through a friend of mine who was my college roommate, which introduced me to Arlene, and I've known Arlene on and off, but since I moved to Berkeley, we became a lot more friendly and friends. And one of the things that you might not know, Arlene also founded the Himalayan Fair, which is now 31 years old, and it takes place every May in Berkeley. And in that, also Arlene's been recognized by the city of Berkeley for her contributions to the community. And actually, Tuesdays is Arlene Blum's day in Berkeley. And I'm not going to take any more time. And welcome, Arlene.
Well, thank you, Ingrid. I'm delighted to be here. And some people say, like, what's the connection between molecules and mountains? And I should say the work I'm doing right now is about molecules. It's about finding ways to remove or replace some of the most harmful chemicals in our everyday products so that we can all be healthier. But everything I do, I feel like I wouldn't do if I weren't a mountain climber. Because everything I do, I'm told it's completely impossible and there's no way it can happen. And if you're a mountain climber, when you hear that, you go, that sounds interesting. Now, some of you in your job, do you feel that way? Like it's completely impossible and it can never happen. But then when you think about mountain climbing, you just have to try. So I think a lot of what I do in both mountain climbing and science is just, plodding and persevering up the mountain. So I started doing both back at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. This is my freshman chemistry lab. And my professor was 23 and had a PhD from MIT in chemistry, which was pretty unusual in the 60s. There were 4 girls in my freshman chemistry class. All 4 of us got PhDs in chemistry, which says something about the importance of role models, and I think all of you can be role models. My lab partner was a very handsome young man from Portland who was a mountain climber, and we studied chemistry till late one starry night, and he said, "Do you want to climb Mount Hood tonight?" And he was very handsome, so I said, "Sure." And we drove up to Timberline Lodge, if some of you know it, and he'd put a big pack on my back. It was like 3 in the morning. We started up the hill. I was from Chicago. I'd never done anything like that, and I started gasping. I was a little short-winded, and he later told me I was gasping so loudly he didn't think I'd make it out of the parking lot. However, he was very handsome. So I kept gasping, and I came to a glacier. The sun rose. It was the most beautiful place I'd ever been in my life, and I fell in love with him and with chemistry and mountain climbing, and it all kind of always has been pretty together in my life. So I spent years climbing mountains, doing chemistry, and I was a grad student here at UC Berkeley and just passed my oral exams, which was a big deal. And I heard about a guided climb to Mount McKinley, the highest mountain in North America. And I wrote to see if I could go, and the answer was women could go as far as base camp and help with the cooking. So I called and asked, and I said, well, actually, I'd climbed in Peru higher than McKinley with my friends from Reed. And I said, well, I've climbed higher. I think I could climb McKinley. And they said, no, women aren't physically strong enough or emotionally stable enough. And that was like fact, And I thought, well, I wonder if a team of women, all women, could climb McKinley all by themselves. And that was very revolutionary. And we really didn't know if we could. This was way back in 1970. We named ourselves the Denali Damsels. And nowadays people pull their loads on sleds, but we hadn't thought of it. So we were carrying, you have to take about 200 pounds of things to climb Denali. So you carry it in about 3 loads. But that's why they thought women weren't strong enough, to carry those kinds of loads. But slowly we could. And it was one of the most beautiful places I'd ever been. I was 25 at the time. I'd organized the expedition, so I was the deputy leader. And our leader was a 50-year-old Alaskan woman who had done the hardest first ascents in Alaska, really experienced. But it turns out she'd never climbed anything very high. Alaskan mountains are pretty low. She'd tried Denali and not made it because she had an altitude barrier. There are people who can be really strong up to a certain height, but above that height, they're not strong at all. So she was one of these people. And this is now summit morning. We're at 17,000 feet. And she's been going slower and slower. And she has a migraine, and she's really not feeling well. And I'm like, you shouldn't go up the mountain. And of course, she ignored me. She said, I'm going up the mountain. And so we headed up pretty slowly. and we reached the top. So this is the first all-women's ascent of Denali, and it was so early that in the 80s and 90s I would hear about the first women's teams attempting Denali. Nobody even knew it happened. But the thing to notice is Grace here is sort of slumped down in the snow, and we helped her down a bit, and then she collapsed unconscious. And we're below the summit of Denali. It's getting near dark. I was 25, and I was now the leader of this expedition, and there was a big Arctic storm coming in. So my book-breaking trail, I begin at that moment. You know, that's one of those moments where I was forced to become a leader. And I didn't really know what to do or what I could do, but we put her in a sleeping bag, and we wrapped a rope around her, and we hauled and lowered her down the mountain. So you can see there's the summit where she collapsed, and then we just hauled her down, and two of us stayed up here with her bivvying as it was dark, and the clouds were coming in, and I thought, oh my goodness, what are we going to do if the storm strikes with this unconscious person? Not a good moment. I always, those moments you always remember. But fortunately, the storm held off, and she felt a little better. We were able to get her down a ways, and by the time the storm came in, she was walking. We got down to 14,000 feet and stayed there for several days, just shoveling the snow off our tents every 3 hours. But I was like a different person. My self-confidence level was completely changed. If you read Breaking Trail, you'll learn that I had a childhood with a lot of negative messages, that I really was not, what you hear when you're a little kid, it's hard to get over, and I still go back to those messages. And I remembered thinking, in that tent, I got Grace down the mountain alive. Those messages weren't right. I'm really an okay person. And so that was a big shift for me. And so I continued climbing mountains around the world while I was working on my PhD. And then everything changed when one of my colleagues, who was really the country's best young rock climber, died on a mountain in India, falling through a cornice. And he was an early environmentalist. And at that point, I was a postdoc at Stanford studying protein folding, and actually had just come up with the first, on another mountain, you can read about it in Breaking Trail, but watching the ice dripping in the Pamirs of Central Asia, I figured out something I called temperature jump NMR that showed the first evidence for how proteins folded. And it's kind of started the field of protein folding, which came from the mountains again. But at that point, when my friend died, I didn't want to do protein folding anymore. I wanted to do something that made a difference for the environment. And so I went to Bruce Ames, who had been on my orals committee. Some of you know Bruce Ames? So he was on my orals committee here at Berkeley. And I said, Bruce, in honor of my friend who died, I want to do something that's going to make a difference for the world. What should I do? And Bruce said, oh, I'm so glad you came. Could you work on flame retardants? And this seemed really bizarre to me, how improbable. And he said, yeah, there's this flame retardant. It's called Tris, and it's in children's sleepwear. It's 10% of the weight of the sleepwear. It's not covalently bonded, so it can come out. And I think it's a really bad chemical, a strong mutagen. Can you work on that? And this seemed very bizarre to me, but I was adequately depressed after my friend had died. Like, sure, I'll work on that, Bruce. And so I found a little girl who'd never worn these pajamas, and because her mom bought the pajamas in England, and we got her to wear Tris pajamas. The first morning, her urine had Tris breakdown products, which were cancer-causing chemicals. And then we ran mutagenicity screens. It was one of the strongest mutagens that anybody had ever seen. And all the kids in America were wearing this Tris-treated pajamas. So I thought, oh my God, I've got to write this up. I've got to do something. And then I got an invitation to this mountain. Do you know what mountain it is? It's Mount Everest. And at that point, no American woman had even tried Mount Everest. So I had this terrible dilemma. Did I go be the first American woman to try Mount Everest, or did I stay and write my paper on the toxic pajamas? So how many of you would go to Mount Everest? How many of you would stay and write on the toxic pajamas? Well, I did both. So I did go to Mount Everest, but every night when in climbing in these beautiful places, like this is the big ice fall on Everest, and crossing these scary ladders, But every night I'd get to camp and I'd write my paper. And this is my high point on Everest. I'm at about 24.5. And this is the Petri plate without tris, only 2 plates. And this is with the tris, lots and lots of bacterial colonies because it was a strong mutagen. So I sent my paper by mail runner back to Berkeley. And it came out in Science magazine as a big lead article. A few months later, we reached the summit of Everest. We were the second American Everest expedition. Now people do it all the time. In those days, the first was in '63, and we were the bicentennial in '78. And we wrote this paper, and the subtitle is kind of unusual for a scientific paper. The main flame retardant in children's pajamas is a mutagen and should not be used. Now, what do most scientific papers say at the end should be done next? For further study. And how often do people do like 2 experiments and make such a strong recommendation? And that's the model of the Green Science Policy Institute, is we think scientists should take their research and make recommendations in the public interest and go beyond more study is needed. We always do need more study, but not all scientists, but we do need some scientists to speak up about what they're finding. And when they do, it's incredibly powerful. So I should just say, well, I'll say more, but what we have been able to do at the Green Science Policy Institute by taking a mountain of peer-reviewed research and using it to inform people is really change policy in a way that protects our health. And so that model came from this paper. So that was January 1977. And April 1977, the Consumer Product Safety Commission banned tris from kids' pajamas. So it worked. However, when brominated tris was banned, what's the replacement? Chlorinated tris. Because industry wants to keep processes as similar as possible. They look for a drop-in replacement that has all the same characteristics of function and often has all the same characteristics of toxicity. And that is a common problem. So chlorinated tris was the replacement. We ran more mutagenicity tests. It was a weak mutagen. We wrote another paper in Science. Chlorinated tris was removed from kids' pajamas. However, it was continued to be used in other products. So did anybody here buy a new couch or chair with foam inside between 2006 and 2012? Okay, so you have about an 80% chance of having half a pound or a pound of chlorinated tris in your house, because that was the chemical of choice. It got listed as cancer-causing a couple years ago by the state of California. It's not being used anymore, but for about 6 years, that was about 5% of the weight of the foam in most furniture. So it continued to be used. Okay, but meanwhile, I continued to go climbing. At that point, in the 70s, all the world's highest mountains of 8,000 meters had been climbed by men, and not a single woman had climbed to 8,000 meters. And I thought it was time to give women a chance. So I got a permit for Annapurna I. It's the 10th highest mountain in the world. We hope it would be safe. It's the first 8,000 meter peak ever climbed. So of course, as luck would have it, guess what's the most dangerous 8,000 meter peak? Highest fatality rate, hardest to climb. So we didn't know at that time because, we were just getting started and learning about these things. So this is our team. In those days, we ranged in age from 20 to 50, and we're all still friends. We just had a reunion about a month ago. And it's funny how nobody changes much. Margie was a geology grad student then, very outgoing, a little pushy. Now she's a geology professor, very outgoing, a little pushy. But we all stayed the same. We're all good friends. And we needed to raise $80,000 to finance our expedition, which we raised selling these T-shirts, still for sale on the Arlene Blum website. So this was Annapurna, just an incredibly beautiful place, but with steep ice climbing, huge avalanches, very narrow ridges we had to climb along. So it was very challenging, and at the time we didn't know that it was the hardest mountain, 8,000 meter peak, but we knew it was hard. But we persevered, we reached the summit. We were the first women, the first Americans. And We had a Nepalese flag, an American flag, held together by a Save the Whales pin. And, but tragically, another group, 2 women, wanted to make a second summit bid, and they fell to their deaths. So this was very mixed, and we were very sad, but we had climbed the mountain. This is Irene, who's a physicist locally, who was the first American woman to reach the summit. So after that, I wanted to walk the length of the Himalayas, to go to all these places while walking, and did an Indian American women's expedition that did a hard first ascent, met Indira Gandhi, and asked for permission to walk across the Indian Himalayas, which no one had done before because the borders are closed, so she gave us the permission. And this was another adventure of a lot of walking across Bhutan, Sikkim, Nepal, and India. It was about 10 months. And I was walking with Hugh Swift, who had written a guidebook to those areas, so he knew where to go. And we went over 19,000-foot passes, straight down into valleys, and we came everywhere on a most auspicious day. So this is Bhutan on the day of the big archery festival. Most places we were, they'd never seen Westerners, so we were treated like visitors from the gods. And we were in Sikkim one day, and the Dalai Lama was there giving a speech in English. And it was pretty amazing, because I think we were the only English speakers at the speech. So we entered Nepal on the Day of the Dog, when dogs are given little marigold wreaths and tikas and fed special treats. And we had groups of trekkers who met us along the way, and I don't know if I'll do them anymore. I usually use this to say that I still lead occasional adventures, and I've gotten so busy, I'm not sure, but I have maybe once a year led an adventure. And in fact, we have mailing list sheets that we're going to pass out. If people sign up and say something like trekking, you hear from me 4 times a year. But if you sign up and say something like chemistry, you hear from me once a month. So maybe we'll just pass those out while I'm talking if people want to hear from us. And print carefully. Be sure to put down your zip code. It's how we divide people. Okay, so along the way, I put these in since this is a diversity group, but we really thought the women of the Himalayas were just extraordinarily beautiful, and so we took pictures of just the gorgeous, gorgeous women we saw as we walked across, of all ages, and working hard. Most of the hard physical work, for some reason, was done by the women, so here they are building roads, carrying all the grains, working in the fields, and when you saw the schools, it was pretty much all boys that went to school, so it's a bit backward, and hopefully it's changed since then. And from that, as Ingrid said, I came back, and I wanted to share all that with people in Berkeley, and so we have the Berkeley Himalayan Fair. It's the 3rd or 4th weekend in May in Live Oak Park. I think we haven't decided for sure if it's the 3rd or 4th weekend yet, but if you sign up for either mailing list, you'll get an invitation to the Himalayan Fair. So other adventures, when my daughter Annalise was born, I thought maybe she won't like walking, and she didn't for a long time. So her dad and I carried her across the Alps from Yugoslavia to France in her little Gore-Tex baby suit. And so she grew up to, this is her gap year. We think gap years are great. And so Annalise became an environmental engineer who minored in political science, right? Very good. Don't tell her she's anything like me, though, or I'll get in big trouble. So she wants to bring water and sanitation to people in developing countries. She's a water engineer. And meanwhile, I wrote 2 books, Annapurna and Breaking Trail. And right at the end of Breaking Trail, it took me 20 years to write Breaking Trail. I wrote Annapurna in a year about that adventure, and it got a lot of recognition, and someone said, you should write a book about how you got there. And I thought, oh, that'll take another year. But it took 20 years, because I tried to understand my family and my childhood. It was like a big therapy project, lots of climbing, but a lot of trying to understand things. And meanwhile, I'd been, raising my daughter. I wasn't doing science. Took a big break from science to be a mom and write the book, do other things. And so about 8 years ago, I finished the book. My daughter was starting college. The last sentence of the book is, my future is like an unbroken slope of snow, and I hope I can break trail using science to a healthier world. And at that point, I did not have a clue what I was going to do. It had been 26 years I had not done science, because I quit science in 1980 when Reagan became president, and all the people doing the kind of work I was doing were losing their grants, and the EPA scientists were being told to do enforcement work. You know, it was a bad time for science, the 80s. I thought I'll take 4 years off and walk across the Himalayas in 1980, and suddenly it was 2006. And I thought, oh my goodness, maybe I can get a job at Berkeley washing test tubes in a lab. You know, I just really wanted to do something with science suddenly. And I'd spent 20 years writing this book, like a big therapy project. Hopefully I was cured a little bit. My daughter was starting college. And so the last 8 years has been the biggest adventure of my life. And it's all about chemistry. It's all about chemistry and using chemistry to make the world a better place. And I like to say, if I hadn't climbed Annapurna, I wouldn't have been able to do any of this, because a lot of the things I've done, we'll see how much time we have, I've been told they're absolutely impossible. And that's kind of the theme. And there's just an array of impossible things. But actually, in the last 8 years, I've now learned how to do them. We now have an institute. We have lots of really smart young PhDs who are working with us, and who are very good at chemistry but want to do something beyond basic research. Not to say it's not great to do basic research, but some people want to use that. And so that's what we try to give an opportunity for. So one of the stories I'm going to tell is about Technical Bulletin 117. Does anybody know what that is? It is a unique flammability standard that we have in California that says that our furniture has to resist a candle flame for 12 seconds, that the foam in our furniture, inside our furniture. And to do that, that foam is usually 5% by weight a flame retardant, like that tris that was in kids' pajamas. And it turns out it doesn't really provide a benefit, because it says the foam inside will resist a candle flame, a very small candle flame. But if you drop a candle on your couch, what burns first? Material. You have a big flame. Then it burns, the whole thing burns in a second or two, and in the presence of these halogenated flame retardants, you get way more soot, smoke, and toxic gases. And what is it that kills you in fires? Yeah. So there's no net benefit. This is pretty well established. So this standard started in the 70s, and the chemical used to meet it is this chemical. Quick chemistry lesson. This is a phenyl ring. 2 phenyl rings is biphenyl. You put lots of chlorines around it. You have polychlorinated biphenyl, PCB. Not such a good molecule. Very persistent, cancer-causing. If instead of chlorine you have bromine and you have an ether bond instead of a covalent bond, you have a polybrominated biphenyl ether. When you hear PBDE, that's what this is, polybrominated biphenyl ether. If you burn or oxidize, you get quite a lot of dioxins and furans, also very persistent and cancer-causing. So if you have a couch or any furniture that was purchased in California between about 1980 and 2006, this will be about 5% of the weight of the foam. Anybody have furniture from then? Okay, so you have a pound or two of that in your house. So halfway between a PCB and a dioxin, how does that sound to you? Not so good. Not so good, yeah. I know. We have summer students, some summers doing courses on chemistry and policy, and I was sort of saying to one of the chem professors on campus, so what do you think about the students, collecting samples and, measuring this one? And it's called Penta, because it's the one with 5 bromines. And they're like, only with, in a fume hood with full protective gear. On the other hand, that's what's in most people's couches. So it was used, I guess, from 1975 to 2004, and 98% of the usage was in North America. It's become a huge global pollutant, and it's pretty much based on that TB117 led to this global use of this chemical. So what are the health effects? They're long-term. It's not like you get a rash. They're chronic, but it's an endocrine disruptor, causes neurodevelopmental problems, reproductive problems, immune suppression, and cancer. And when I hear the chemical industry saying there's no known harm from a flame retardant, like this, which they always did until I showed up, we decided to look and see how many papers there were. So there are more than 4,000 peer-reviewed papers right now. Some are analytic techniques, but most of them are the chemicals accumulating in humans, animals, the environment, and the health effects. And again, the TB117 happened here. Penta started to being used. Penta was phased out here, but the papers go on, because when you make a decision to use chemicals like that at high volumes, you can stop using them, but they're still in your furniture, your dust, your body, the environment. They stay around, and they're still subject for a lot of research. What about human health? So because human health should never be the criteria for saying a chemical is problematic, because we all move around a lot, we're exposed to many things. Now, everybody's looking depressed, except me. So this story ends happily. It does. Trust me. It does. It's not too unhappy. It gets better. Okay, but this is not a happy slide. There have been a lot of human epidemiology studies. I mean, a lot, maybe 30. And it's pretty conclusive that when women have higher levels, it takes longer to get pregnant. During critical windows of brain development, they have different thyroid hormone levels that are not so good for brain development. The children have lower birth weight, impaired attention, poorer coordination, lowered IQ. And this is studies at Columbia and here at UC Berkeley. I asked for an estimate of one of the scientists, like, how many IQ points do you think the average California child lost? And she said about 4. But when you look at that across the population, it's not a good thing for a chemical that did not provide a fire safety benefit. Remember, it wasn't a good standard. So how do they get out? They're semi-volatile organics. Bill Nazaroff, some of you know, I think he works up here a bit. Yeah, so Bill has papers about it, but they're SVOCs. They're continually coming out. They drop into dust. Hand-to-mouth contact is how people are exposed. Toddlers who crawl in the dust tend to have 3 times the level of their parents, which is not good at a time of brain and reproductive organ development. Cats have 10 to 100 times higher than humans levels. Why would that be? The grooming behavior. And that's my couch, because my dust level was 97% parts per million penta. Because I do this research, I measured my own dust, and all my furniture had penta. And so I got rid of it all, and 4 years later, my level went to 3 parts per million. According to Bill, it makes thin films on my walls and windows, and even though I get rid of it all, I said, can't I wash my walls and windows? And he's like, nope, there's always a little bit left. But 3 parts per million is way better than 97 parts per million. And I actually got my body level measured. Unfortunately, it wasn't back when I had the high dust level, but when I had the low dust level, I had a fairly low body level, which means over 4 years after I got rid of all my furniture, it's gone. It got out of my body. So that's a good thing. So the flame retardant penta, which was used primarily in California, has traveled the world, and you find it in polar bears at the North Pole, Tasmanian devils towards the South Pole. The highest levels are in marine mammals off California and all top of the food chain predators. So again, there's a long-term and global impact from these chemicals. Is there a fire safety benefit? In research comparing couches, if you compare the foam that meets TB117 doesn't burn for 12 seconds, but if you put the foam in a couch, there's no real difference. And there are a lot of studies now showing that. So we thought, well, when I first did this, I thought, we'll just tell everybody and they'll stop using it. So we met Mark Leno, and he said, I'll write a bill. And so there were 4 bills over 6 years. And in support of this were just about everybody. The furniture industry, the foam industry, the fabric industry. They didn't want to poison their workers or the public. Scientists, public health people, firefighters, interestingly, supported not using the flame retardant because they have fairly high levels of cancer associated with dioxin exposure that really worry them. And when the flame retardants burn, you get high levels of brominated dioxins. So why did these bills not pass for 6 years with almost everybody in support? So who is not in support? Californians for Fire Safety. This is part of a $7 million in 1 week advertising campaign when there was a chance for one of these bills to pass. And who are Californians for fire safety? They are the 3 companies that make flame retardants: Albemarle, Chemtura, and Israeli Chemicals Limited. Highly profitable, and that's the reason the flame retardants stayed. And why? C&E News, they don't write these articles anymore since I started putting them in my slideshows. Albemarle's profits up 377% from an increase in brominated flame retardant sales. Chemtura will increase prices in all regions by up to 25% to secure continued advocacy efforts. So these 3 companies have a virtually global monopoly, and they really market by making regulations that will use their products. So we did some papers. This is one where we looked at what was in 100 baby products. And when we first submit this paper in ES&T, they said it's not novel enough, and it got turned down. But we said, well, wait, we identified 2 new flame retardants, new analytic techniques. So they took it. Guess what the #1 paper of the year in ES&T was? And I think it's number 6 in readership in the history of the journal, which is a pretty good journal, because people are interested in this kind of information. Even though the analytic chemistry maybe wasn't that unique, nobody knew what was in baby products. And what we found was levels up to 13%, like a baby changing pad that was 13% tris. We found some products with 3 different flame retardants. We discovered 2 new bad-looking flame retardants. And we wrote papers on, oops, out of order, sorry. Anyway, we wrote papers on what was in couches, and we then came together with about 200 scientists and wrote a statement at this big meeting in San Antonio on the problems with the whole class. And not too much was happening until the Chicago Tribune noticed that, and they wrote a series called Playing with Fire. And I think the subtitle says it all. A deceptive campaign by industry brought toxic flame retardants into our homes and our bodies, and the chemicals don't even work as promised. And this was 4 pages, full front page, 4 pages in the paper. There were ultimately 20 front page stories on the duplicity of this industry. And it came in second for the Pulitzer, but it won most other journalism prizes. And we really need this investigative journalism. They built on our peer-reviewed science, but the peer-reviewed science wasn't going there without the journalism. So partly based on that, Governor Brown directed the state agencies to change our standard here in California. He wrote a press release, and I was told he wrote it himself, quite an accurate one. We must find better ways to meet fire safety standards by reducing and eliminating dangerous chemicals. And so TB 117 has changed. If anyone wants to buy a couch, there's a new standard called TB 117 2013. And it was a long process to change it. And right now, I wouldn't buy a couch yet. It's in a messy transition. It was implemented last January, and everybody's changing. I mean, I just heard yesterday from the 2nd largest foam company in the country that their use of flame retardants is now down 90%, which is really good news. But it takes a while for that to get through the supply chain to the furniture stores. If you go to Scandinavian Design, at least the last time I went, all their furniture was the old furniture, and it was on sale. And they said when they sold it off, they'd bring in the new furniture. It wouldn't be on sale. Flame retardants are not banned, but they're not needed to meet the new standards. So if you want to buy furniture, look for the new standard and ask if there are flame retardants present. All these baby products which used to have flame retardants, they're not required anymore. And that was partly due to our papers showing that the flame retardants were in the products and that there was no benefit. So this is a very direct example of how good science, when brought to decision makers, can make a difference. I'll just say a little bit about insulation because there's some unanswered questions that could be answered here at the lab. And I've had a few conversations with people, but it hasn't happened yet. So foam plastic insulations, polystyrene, polyurethane, and polyiso are what we use for energy efficiency. And they're used inside walls, below grades, in attics. And they always are treated with some of the most harmful flame retardants. and they are good for climate change. In fact, Art Rosenfeld, who many of you may know, is one of the major supporters of our insulation project, because he thinks for global climate change it's really important to have good insulation materials that are non-toxic and a little less expensive without the flame retardants. So once again, we wrote a paper, Flame Retardants in Building Insulation, a case for reevaluating building codes. And based on that paper, it included information about what are the chemicals. Spray foam, blown-in insulation usually contains a kind of tris that accumulates in the liver and kidneys and is a potential carcinogen. Insulation with polystyrene, that's like EPS and XPS, always contains hexabromocyclododecane, which has a lot of undesirable properties such that it's been banned in 160 countries under the Stockholm Convention. There have only been 23 chemicals so banned, and HBCD is one of them. We have not signed the Stockholm Convention, but we are phasing out of it. But what's the replacement? You take butadiene, which is cancer-causing. You take styrene, which is cancer-causing. You make a copolymer, and you put lots of bromine around it. And those are the three companies, and they're all making a version. And the sort of scary thing is it's already in production in China. They're all building plants in China, and they're making a lot of it. And most of the places, let's see if I have a diagram here, most of the places where it's used, I'll go back to the first slide, where it's used, there's not a real fire safety benefit. So below grade, like between the slab and the soil here, you use these materials where it can just go out into the soil and the water. There's no fire benefit. And most walls have a 15-minute flashover requirement, so they have a thermal barrier where you don't reach the insulation until the room has flashed over for 15 minutes. So at that point, you reach the insulation, and the 2% flame retardant insulation just makes it more toxic for the firefighters. There's really no benefit in most of the uses. So that's kind of what this paper said, talking about the toxicity. But this is a much bigger industry. The furniture is about 20 million pounds a year, and insulation is already about 140 million. So it's going to be very challenging to change codes. But we have had code change efforts. Our first one was the 2015 International Residential Code. Our effort failed, but there was a long discussion, and now we're going to try for the 2018 International Building Code. But the only way, really, people talk about replacements, blue jeans, mushrooms, whatever. And a few people are going to do there's some good replacements, but those are going to be high-end. Most people are going to keep using these foam plastic insulations, and the only way we can get the flame retardants out is to change the codes and standards. So here in California, legislation actually passed telling the fire marshal to review our flammability standards, and that's in process. We'll see what happens. So if you want to know more about this, a film about stopping the use of flame retardants, Jamie Redford, Robert Redford's son, made this hour-and-a-half documentary. And if you have HBO, it's on HBO. It's going to be streamed free starting Saturday for a week on, where is Veronica? Who'll remember where? Yes, Dr. McCullough's station, whatever that is streaming this free for a week if you want to see Toxic Hot Seat. And the whole movie started, I did one day, if you're on my mailing list, you'll hear I do a one-day series on flame retardants every February, and that's where the film started. Just about everybody who spoke in my series ended up in this film. So with flammability standards, I think we can improve them, and we can have both fire safety and a healthy world. And I'm just going to say a little bit about other chemicals, because I have a couple minutes, and then we'll have questions, because that's one class of chemicals, and we have gotten together with lots of scientists and people in industry and came up with the concept that there are 6 chemical classes, of which flame retardants are one, that contain most of the toxics in our consumer products. And with flame retardants, you can just change the standard, but with the rest, you need substitutes. And so we're very interested in working on collaboratively to come up with substitutes. And just to say the most interesting, so the worst of the worst. What do you think is the worst of the worst class of chemicals? Most persistent, most toxic? Dioxins. Yeah, though they're kind of an inadvertent thing. We don't produce them for our products. They might be, but a class that we use in so many of our products every day. Fluorinated chemicals, stain and water repellents. They have a 2,000-year half-life. As the EPA says, they're everywhere, they're toxic, and they never go away. You know, things with a 2,000-year half-life is a big decision. Now, we had breakfast this morning with the North Face sustainability people because they put that, you know, outdoor gear. Everything's stain and water repellent. A lot of gear, wrappings that go around our food. We've been doing testing, and you would be surprised the places in downtown Berkeley, we're going to talk to them, that have PFCs in their food wrapping. They don't realize that they're harmful, and, you know. So, in any case, there are 6 classes like that, and just to say that's, I never said the area that we wanted to collaborate on the insulation, because I hadn't thought of that before. There's some question of whether the flame retardants really come out of the walls. Apologize for the lack of order, but what I thought of it. So they're behind these thermal barrier walls, and the flame retardants are always found in the dust. But the flame retardant industry claims they don't come out from the walls, they're in the dust because they're in other products. And they are used to a smaller extent to other products. So the interesting study that I believe the lab has the capability to do that nobody's really done is to show whether or not they do come out of the walls into dust. So if any of you are in that group, I think I've spoken a few years ago. I'm so bad at names. But anyway, it would be really interesting to find out if the flame retardants actually do come out of the walls into the dust. And then the other area we're looking for collaborations is coming up. So there are lots of things that offer water repellency, but in terms of repellency to oil and stain, PFCs are really the best, and so it would be really interesting. And we're talking to people working right now with Marty Mulville at the Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry on kind of bioengineering alternatives. So anyway, so that's a little bit of what we're doing, and we always are looking for partners, and we're always looking for really bright young people to work with us too. So if you know anyone. And we're looking for a great admin right now, not to do all my advertisements. Okay, so any questions? Yes. Oh, right. So the story is I went to a green chemistry meeting, and there was one industry guy there. It turned out he was from the foam industry, and he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I used to work on flame retardants, 25 years ago." And he said, "Oh, flame retardants. We're really worried about them. We used to have this great flame retardant called Penta, and now they told us it's bad. We can't use it anymore." This was 2006. So the substitute is this tris, and we're a little bit worried. Might you know anything about tris? And that was funny. And I said, "Oh, my God, it's the same thing we got out of kids' pajamas." And he said, "No, it couldn't be the same." And it was. And then he said, "Well, come address our annual meeting and tell them." And I said, "Well, you don't need me, you can tell them." And he said, "No, they'll kill me, you tell them." So I'm like, "Oh, you want me to come?" So I addressed the annual meeting, and then those companies were all there, and they all offered me a job, which I didn't take. And then through mountain climbing, I knew the publisher of the New York Times and told him the story, and he said, "Do you want to write an op-ed?" So I wrote a big op-ed in the New York Times, and that sort of started it all. But it was very fortuitous. I felt like it was one of these paths where who would ever believe, that I met the right person and had all these opportunities. It's kind of felt that way the whole time. Yes?
Is there any concern about the fluorinated polymers used as non-stick coatings on baking vessels?
Yeah, so it's during production and...
We're also streaming this. Can you repeat the question
Oh.
so that people that are not in the room?
Okay, the question was about Teflon on pans. Is that a problem? And it's the life cycle problem. So during production, 8-chain fluorocarbons are produced. And in fact, also if your pan is scratched and stuff, there's something called parakeet fever. You know, if you have a parakeet in the room and you burn your Teflon pan, the parakeet will probably die. So if the pan has scratches, in proper usage, it shouldn't be a problem for you, but the life cycle is really bad. And just to say kind of a horrifying story, but when I was trekking in Nepal at Christmas, I was reading this great book called Stain-Proof, Water-Resistant, and Lethal, the story of C8. And that's when you have 8 carbons with fluorines all around. And so DuPont was making Teflon in southern Ohio, and they were dumping it in the water supply. And they were actually monitoring it, but they neglected to tell the people who were living in those communities who started getting sick, filed a lawsuit. They measured levels in 200,000 people in southern Ohio and West Virginia, found sky-high levels of what's called C8. And then they have done epidemiology and found very high levels of 3 kinds of cancer and a whole range of health problems. The most recent, a few months ago, was the 5th graders in those communities with high levels have high blood pressure and high cholesterol. So the life cycle is pretty ugly. So our 6 classes is that you shouldn't use any chemicals in those classes unless you really need them and you've got health information. So we discourage the use of Teflon. But once you have your Teflon pan and it's made, it's not going to harm you as long as you don't heat it too hot or scrape it. Long answer, but led to an important story. So we're kind of switching now we're pretty interested in PFCs. So a lot of the scientists working on them have kind of come to us and said, you know, PFCs are the same as flame retardants. There's an industry that's really troubling, and could you help put them on the map a bit? And so, but for PFCs, you really need substitutes. You need to, because they are real functions that you need. So you need better alternatives. Other questions? Yes.
What happens if you get your house reupholstered and they put new foam in? Is that retardant?
Well, nowadays, it's just right now safer foam is available. And in fact, we have a little pilot, I don't know if you said, we have the whole front page story of the Chronicle about 2 weeks ago was about our foam exchange, where people can take the foam inside their cushions and swap out the toxic foam for safer foam. So you just have to make sure you get foam without flame retardants. It's very funny. One of the young people in my lab goes, all that's happening in the world, and the Chronicle puts the foam exchange as their front page. But anyway, so if you Google SF-Gate, foam exchange, we're working with 4 stores that do have safer foam, and they're collecting the foam for us to use to do research. And in fact, we're working with NSF. They're going to sponsor a big meeting. We're trying to bring together a lot of scientists to look at, if there's anyone at LBL, we're looking for people to look at what you do with this toxic foam. Because the question is, so in California, we have, 20 million toxic couches? What do we do with them? And do we pass them on to low-income communities? The average couch has 2 to 3 owners of 10 to 15 years each. So while those of us who afford it can buy new couches without flame retardants in low-income communities, they could be there for a really long time. So we encourage people to, most of the toxicity is in the cushions. The backs and the arms tend not to have foam. They tend to have polyester. So if people can swap out the foam in their cushions, that's a good way to make a safe couch, or reupholster now. But if you reupholstered 3 months ago, it's just coming in right now, the safer foam. And we waited. It was like 2 weeks ago we launched the foam exchange. Anyway, our website, greensciencepolicy.org, you can learn about the foam exchange and learn about a lot more. I just kind of told you a couple stories, but there's a lot more information. So, yes?
I think you focus on writing a Chris article when you have something like that you discussions. Climbing Mount Everest.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Well, I felt pretty concerned, just like I do now, you know. If you know something that could be changed and can make a difference to the health of so many people, you kind of can focus on it. And so, you know, climbing, you can only climb 4 or 5 hours, 6 hours a day, and so then you're in the tent. You can write or edit. Is there another question back there?
Well, I was just about to buy a new couch, but now I'll wait. But I now have a better excuse for my husband to say, we need a new couch.
Or just swap out your phone if your couch doesn't.
No, I don't want to. I want a new couch. Sticking with the other story. But when we go to purchase it, is it easy to find out what couches are made of, or is it difficult, or do we have to do this ahead of time?
They're just coming into the stores because they're selling off all the old ones, but you want to look for a label that says TB117-2013.
So it's on
Yeah.
couches.
If you all go home and lift up the center cushion on your couch, you'll find a label that says TB117. You probably all will, which means you have 5% of the weight of that foam is either Tris or Penta, or there are a couple of other delicious alternatives. But the safer foam, if the big, they said all the foam manufacturers that it's pretty much down to only 10%, and it goes into cars. So they're still using the treated foam in cars, but I think it's coming out of furniture. But you have to ask, and you really want that 2013, not the TB117. And on our website, we have a consumer page that lists companies that say we don't verify it, but companies that say they have the flame retardants out, we do list them. If you go to our consumer page, you can find some things. Yes?
Arlene, I was going to ask you if this is also in mattresses and the memory foam and things like that.
So mattresses, probably not. It's interesting because European Sleepworks is always advertising to buy their expensive mattresses to avoid flame retardants, but they don't really have them, probably. The deal is it's all about that standard. So the standard for mattresses is way more severe. It's half an hour with a blowtorch, not 8 seconds with a candle. And so they wrap the whole mattress in an inherently flame retardant fabric, or sometimes they don't use these flame retardants because these flame retardants aren't going to help. So there's no reason to have them in mattresses. That's not to say they're never there, because back in the days when so much foam contained them, it could by accident be there, but it would be by accident. So most mattresses don't. At one point, we had our summer students collect lots of mattresses, but most of them were like from dumpsters, the summer students at the end of the year. And some of them did have flame retardants, but they might have been old. The standard I'm talking about started in 2006. So before 2006, people might have just put them in on a random basis. My mattress, of course, did have flame retardants. It was from 1995 in Colorado. But the mattress industry and the foam industry sort of swear they don't put flame retardants in. I'm a little skeptical, but probably not. Memory foam, probably not. You don't know for sure. Yes?
What's the fabric that covers the mattress made out of?
Polymers. So when you have, say, a toxic monomer 1, just kind of, it can go in, it can come out. When you have a polymer, it gets permanently attached. And so maybe...
Expensive to make, so.
Yeah, well, it's not that expensive. So they wrap them in polymers. And sometimes they just use cotton treated with boric acid, which is a pretty good flame retardant. And boric acid, as long as you don't eat it, isn't a real problem. These things, they're persistent. So I think, I can't swear to it, but I think if you want an organic mattress, it's fine, but I wouldn't do it because of flame retardants in the foam. Yes?
So are the baby products now safe, and if they are, since when?
So it's taking a while for the transition. The baby products no longer are required to use flame retardants, but I think they're still selling off the old ones. We've been looking in the stores, and they still tend to have TB117 labels. So the new products will have no label, and they should have no flame retardants. But it's going to take a while, because again, the foam companies just are it's complicated. When you change a 38-year-old law, we have calls with all the manufacturers and retailers trying to get them all moving together, but there were tests and the test materials weren't available. It's just been a very complex, it's a messy transition. So it's just now that the safer foam is available, and then the baby products will get made with it, and then they'll sell off all the old stuff. The thing about baby products is a lot of them are made of polyester, not polyurethane. And polyester is naturally flame retardant. So even if it has a TB117 label, if it has polyester, it should be okay. If it has polyurethane, it probably has flame retardants, if you need baby products now. And we've been spot checking, and we still don't see them in the stores without the labels. But it should happen soon, we hope. Yes?
Even if there's the new label 117-2013, couldn't they still be using foam that has flame retardant?
They absolutely could, because it does, so you have to ask. And what I've heard is most of the, just asking quietly in the industry, that almost all the major companies are not using, so it used to be all the foam was flame retardant, you had to special order it without. Now it's pretty much all not, and you have to special order it with. But there are a small number of furniture companies that are still requiring it because of some lawyer or liability reason. So you have to ask. Okay, well, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your participation and all the questions. Very interesting subject matter. Thought it was great. Have a great day, and we'll see you back here on the 18th of August for Jeanette Brown. Thanks. Bye-bye. That was a very good one.